I'm Elena. I just turned 25, and yesterday my parents handed me a legal document disowning me in front of 50 of the wealthiest people in the city. The dining room was a sea of polished mahogany and sparkling crystal. The air smelled of expensive lilies, and the heavy musky scent of my father's cologne. I sat at the head of the table in a silk dress the color of moonlight, a dress I had bought specifically because my mother told me it made me look important. I thought this was a celebration of my birth. I thought the smiles on their faces were genuine. But as the gold-rimmed clock on the mantel ticked toward 8, the atmosphere shifted. The warmth in the room didn't just fade, it froze. My father stood up, his silver hair slicked back perfectly. He didn't look at me with love. He looked at me like a business deal that had gone bad. He tapped a silver spoon against his wine glass, a sound that rang out like a funeral bell. "Everyone," he said, his voice as smooth as velvet and twice as thick. "We are here to mark a milestone. Elena has reached an age where she must stand on her own. And since she has chosen to pursue artistic hobbies instead of the family legacy, we have decided to help her find her independence." He slid a heavy, cream-colored envelope across the table. It stopped right in front of my birthday cake. My mother leaned forward, her diamonds catching the light. She didn't whisper. She spoke loudly enough for the entire table to hear. "Don't look so shocked, Elena. You've been a parasite in this house for long enough. We've scrubbed your name from the trust. By tomorrow morning, your key won't work, and your accounts will be closed. We won't have our reputation dragged down by a daughter who dreams of paint and canvas while we build empires." The room went silent. I could feel the eyes of our friends on me. I saw the pity in some, but mostly, I saw the cold amusement. I felt the blood rush to my face, but I didn't let a single tear fall. My heart was thumping against my ribs like a trapped bird, but my hand stayed perfectly still on the silk of my lap. I didn't scream. I didn't throw the wine in her face. Instead, I did something that made the smirk vanish from my mother's lips. I leaned forward, picked up the envelope, and tucked it into my clutch bag. Then, I stood up slowly, adjusted my dress, and looked my father directly in the eye. I leaned down and blew out the candles on my cake, the smoke curling into the air like a ghost. I leaned in close to my father's ear and whispered just 5 words. "Thank you for the clarity." I walked out of that room with my head held high, the sound of my heels clicking against the marble floor like a countdown. I walked past the servants, past the portraits of ancestors who probably would have hated me, and out into the cold, biting night air. Before I tell you what was in that envelope and how I turned those papers into a weapon, please like, subscribe, and tell me in the comments, where are you watching from, and what time is it there? Now, let's go back to where it all began. The truth is, I had seen the cracks in our family for years, but I chose to paint over them. Growing up as the daughter of the Sterling family meant living in a house that felt more like a museum than a home. Everything was for show. My brother Julian was the golden child. He was the one who went to the right business schools and laughed at the right jokes. I was the quiet one. I spent my time in the attic, watching the way light hit the dust motes, and trying to capture the feeling of loneliness on a canvas. My parents hated it. To them, art was something you bought to show off your wealth, not something you actually did. The week leading up to my birthday had been strange. My mother had been unusually kind, helping me pick out the silk dress, and promising that the party would be unforgettable. I fell for it. I wanted to believe that, at 25, they finally saw me as an adult they could be proud of. I spent my meager savings from a small gallery job to buy my father a vintage watch, thinking it would be a bridge between us. He never even opened it. As I walked down the long winding driveway of the Sterling estate that night, the rain began to fall. It wasn't a heavy storm, just a cold, misting drizzle that soaked into my hair and made my silk dress cling to my skin. I didn't have a car. It was in my father's name. I didn't have a phone that would work past midnight. All I had was the envelope in my bag and the burning sensation in my chest. I walked until my feet bled in my designer heels. I found a small park bench under a street lamp and finally opened the envelope. It wasn't just a disownment, it was a bill. A detailed list of every cent they had spent on my lifestyle since I turned 18. They wanted me to know exactly how much they thought I owed them for the crime of being their daughter. I sat there, the ink running slightly from the rain, and I realized something. They hadn't just kicked me out. They had tried to bury me. They wanted me to crawl back, begging for forgiveness, willing to marry whatever businessmen they chose, just to have a roof over my head. But they forgot one thing. They had spent 25 years teaching me how to be a Sterling, and a Sterling never loses. They only wait for the right moment to strike. I pulled a small charcoal pencil from my bag, the one thing I always carried. On the back of the legal paper, I didn't write a plea. I didn't write a curse. I drew a single, perfect circle. A cycle. I stood up, the rain now washing the salt of my hidden tears away. I knew a woman who ran a small, dusty studio in the basement of an old warehouse. She had told me once that I had a gift for seeing the world not as it is, but as it could be. "I'll show them," I whispered to the empty street. "I'll show them what happens when you throw away the only person who actually loved you for who you were, and not for your name." I started walking again, not toward a hotel or a friend's house, but toward the darkest part of the city. I had a plan, but it required me to disappear. I needed to become a ghost so that one day I could return as a queen. But as I reached the end of the block, a black car pulled up beside me. The window rolled down, and a face I hadn't seen in years looked out at me. A face that knew the Sterling's darkest secrets, and a face that had every reason to want them gone just as much as I did. The black car sat idling against the curb, its engine a low, predatory hum that vibrated in the soles of my ruined heels. The window glass was tinted so dark it looked like a void, but as it lowered, the orange glow of the street lamp revealed a man I hadn't seen since I was 16. It was Silas Thorne. Years ago, he had been my father's right-hand man, the brilliant architect of the Sterling fortune, until my father betrayed him to protect his own ego. Silas had been erased from our lives, his name never to be spoken again. Now he sat there, his face etched with the kind of hard-earned wisdom that only comes from losing everything and clawing it back. "The silk looks better when it's dry, Elena," Silas said, his voice a gravelly baritone that cut through the sound of the rain. He didn't offer a smile. He didn't offer pity. He simply pushed the door open. "Get in, or stay out here and see if your father's friends come back to help you." Hint: they won't. I hesitated for only a heartbeat. The rain was beginning to seep into the marrow of my bones, and the weight of the cream-colored envelope in my clutch felt like a lead brick. I slid into the leather seat. The interior of the car smelled of cedarwood and old books, a sharp contrast to the suffocating lilies of the mansion I had just left. As the car pulled away, I watched the Sterling gates disappear in the rearview mirror. I didn't look back with longing. I looked back with a cold, sharpening clarity. "I saw the dinner," Silas remarked, his eyes fixed on the road. "I have people inside that house. Your father always liked a public execution. He thinks it makes him look powerful. He doesn't realize it just makes him look desperate." "He didn't just kick me out, Silas," I said, my voice steady despite the shaking in my hands. I pulled out the list, the invoice for my life. "He wants me to owe him for the air I breathed in his house." Silas glanced at the paper as we stopped at a red light. He let out a short, dry laugh. Classic Arthur Sterling. "He's trying to own your future because he knows he can't control your spirit." "So what's the move, Elena? Do you go to a cheap motel and cry until the money runs out? Or do you realize that the name Sterling is just a brand and you're the one who knows how to design the product?" We drove deep into the industrial district, where the gleaming skyscrapers of the wealthy gave way to the rusted, honest bones of the city. We stopped in front of a massive, weathered warehouse. Silas led me inside, past rows of heavy machinery and crates, up to a glass-walled loft that overlooked the city's skyline. It was minimalist, cold, and perfect. "You can stay in the guest suite here," Silas said, gesturing to a door. "But there's a price. Not money. I want your eyes. I've seen your sketches, Elena. I've seen the way you look at architecture and space. My firm is growing, but it lacks the soul that a Sterling, a real Sterling, can provide. Work for me, under a different name. Disappear into the work." I stripped off the wet silk dress, the last thing my mother had chosen for me, and dropped it into a metal trash can in the corner of the room. I found a box of matches on the kitchen counter. I struck one, the sulphurous scent filling the air, and dropped it onto the fabric. I watched the moonlight-colored silk blacken and curl, the flames casting long, dancing shadows against the concrete walls. I sat on the edge of the bed, wrapped in a plain cotton robe Silas had left for me. I felt lighter. The girl who wanted her father's approval had burned with the dress. What was left was something harder, something forged in the cold rain. I spent the next 48 hours in a trance of productivity. I didn't check the news. I didn't try to call my brother Julian. I knew Julian would have changed his number by now, or at the very least, he would be busy celebrating his increased share of the inheritance. Instead, I grabbed a stack of blueprint paper and a set of drafting pens. I began to draw. Not the flowers or portraits I used to hide in the attic, but structures. I drew houses that looked like fortresses. I drew windows that let in light but kept out the world. My style was different now. It was sharp, aggressive, and mathematical. I was no longer painting my feelings. I was designing a world where I held the keys. Silas came in on the third morning carrying 2 cups of black coffee. He walked over to the drafting table and stood silent for a long time, looking at my work. I didn't explain myself. I didn't ask if it was good. I just waited. "This," he said, pointing to a design for a cantilevered glass guest house hanging over a cliffside. "This is beautiful. It's also incredibly lonely." "It's not lonely, Silas," I replied, taking a sip of the bitter coffee. "It's private. There's a difference. You're going to be a star," he whispered. "But the moment you put your name on this, your father will come for the royalties. He'll claim he funded your education, that your talent belongs to the Sterling estate. Then I won't use my name," I said. I looked out at the city, where the morning sun was just beginning to hit the glass towers of the financial district. Somewhere out there, my mother was likely having tea, telling her friends how difficult I had been, and how they had no choice but to let me go. "From now on, I am Evie Thorne. I'll take your name, Silas." Since my father decided I wasn't worth his, Silas looked at me, a glimmer of respect, and perhaps a hint of fear, in his eyes, a thorn among the Sterlings. "I like that. But be careful, Elena. Revenge is a slow-growing vine. It can beautify a house, or it can tear the foundation apart." "I'm not looking for beauty," I said, my voice like a serrated blade. "I'm looking for a foundation they can never touch." I spent the next few months buried in blueprints and CAD software. I learned how to negotiate contracts, how to hide assets, and how to read the fine print of property law. I watched the Sterling news from a distance. They were expanding. They were buying up luxury real estate in the hills. They were loud, arrogant, and completely unaware that a ghost was haunting their peripheries. But as I was finishing the final touches on a major project for a reclusive billionaire, Silas walked in with a look of genuine concern. He dropped a newspaper on my desk. The headline wasn't about a business deal. It was a scandal. My brother Julian had been involved in a hit and run, and the Sterling name was being dragged through the mud for the first time in decades. My heart didn't race. It stayed perfectly calm. This was the first crack. "They're losing money trying to bury the story," Silas said. "Your father is selling off some of his smaller holdings to pay for the legal fees and the hush money." "Which holdings?" I asked. Silas pointed to a small, prestigious plot of land on the coast, a place my mother had always called her sanctuary. I looked at the map, and a slow, dark smile spread across my face. It was the first time I had smiled since my birthday. I picked up the phone. It was time to buy my first piece of the past. But I had to be careful. If they knew it was me, they would rather burn the land to ash than sell it. "Silas," I said, "get the shell company ready. We're going to make an offer." Anonymously. But as I hung up the phone, a realization hit me. To buy that land, I had to use the one thing I promised I would never touch again. The secret I had guarded so closely wasn't a bank account or a piece of jewelry. It was a collection of digital files, a hidden ledger I had found on my father's computer when I was 19. Back then, I was just a curious girl looking for family photos, but I had stumbled upon a folder encrypted with a password that was my mother's maiden name. Inside were the true books of the Sterling Empire. It showed the bribes, the corner cutting on construction materials, and the offshore accounts used to dodge taxes. I had saved them to a secure cloud drive, not because I wanted to hurt them, but because I was afraid of them. I wanted insurance. Now I needed to sell a small portion of that information to a specific information broker to get the liquid cash for the down payment on my mother's sanctuary. It felt like walking into a room full of shadows. As I sat in the dim light of Silas's studio, my fingers hovered over the keyboard. To use this data was to finally cut the umbilical cord. Once I touched this, there was no going back to being the quiet daughter. I would be an enemy of the state, or at least the Sterling state. "Are you sure?" Silas asked, leaning against the doorframe. He was watching me with a look that was half admiration and half pity. "Once you use that leverage, they'll know someone is out there with the keys to their kingdom. They'll start looking." "Let them look," I whispered. "They're looking for a ghost. They aren't looking for a thorn." I clicked send, while I waited for the wire transfer to clear. My mind drifted back to the house I grew up in. People think being rich is about comfort, but being a Sterling was about performance. I remembered my 7th birthday. I had asked for a set of oil paints. Instead, my mother gave me a miniature Chanel purse. "A Sterling woman doesn't create," she had told me, her voice as sharp as a diamond. "She inspires, she curates, she possesses. Don't get your hands dirty, Elena. It's common." I remembered the way she would look at my brother Julian with such pride when he repeated my father's cruel jokes. They were a closed circle, and I was just the ornament sitting on the shelf, waiting to be traded for a strategic marriage. The birthday dinner wasn't the beginning of the betrayal. It was just the final signature on a contract that had been written years ago. The chime of my laptop broke the silence. The transfer was complete. I now had enough to outbid anyone for the coastal plot. The auction for the land was held in a sterile, white-walled room in the city's financial heart. My father didn't attend. He was too busy dealing with Julian's lawyers. But he sent his lead attorney, Mr. Henderson. I sat in the back row, wearing a simple charcoal suit, a pair of dark glasses, and a silk scarf wrapped around my hair. I looked like any other junior assistant from a large firm. When the lot for the Azure Bluff came up, the room went quiet. It was a beautiful piece of land, but it was overpriced because of its history. Opening bid $5 million, the auctioneer droned. Henderson raised his hand for the estate. $5 million. I didn't raise my hand. I waited. The price climbed. $6 million. 7. Henderson looked bored. He had been told to buy it back at any cost. Ironic, since they were selling it to cover Julian's mess. They were essentially moving money from one pocket to another, trying to keep the land in the family name through a subsidiary. $8 million, Henderson said, his voice dripping with a sterling arrogance. 8.5, I said softly from the back. The room turned. Henderson squinted at me, trying to place my face behind the oversized glasses. He didn't recognize me. To him, I was just a girl who used to sit at the end of the table and say nothing. 9 million, Henderson snapped, his annoyance showing. 10, I replied. There was a murmur in the room. 10 million for a plot of land that was mostly rock and salt spray? It was madness. Henderson pulled out his phone, likely texting my father. He waited for a minute, then shook his head. The Sterlings were bleeding cash from the scandal. They couldn't afford to play games with a mystery bidder who seemed to have bottomless pockets. Going once? Twice? Sold to the representative from Vesper Holdings, the auctioneer announced. I stood up and walked out before Henderson could approach me. I felt a strange, cold rush of adrenaline. I had just bought my mother's favorite place in the world. I remembered how she used to stand on that bluff and say, "This is the only place where I feel like I own the wind." Now I owned the wind, and she would have to ask me for permission to breathe it. I drove out to the coast that evening. The Azure Bluff was even more beautiful than I remembered. The waves crashed against the jagged rocks below, sending spray high into the air. The sun was setting, turning the sky into a bruised purple and gold. I stood at the edge of the cliff, the wind whipping my hair around my face. I pulled the disownment papers from my pocket, the ones I had carried with me every day. I looked at my father's signature, bold and uncaring. I didn't throw them off the cliff. That would be too dramatic, too emotional. Instead, I folded them neatly and put them back. They were my map. They reminded me of where I was going. I spent the next few weeks working with Silas to design the house that would sit on this land. It wasn't going to be a mansion. It was going to be a masterpiece of glass and steel, the very one I had sketched in the warehouse. I called it the glass cage. But as construction began, I received a letter at my new office. It wasn't from my parents. It was a plain white envelope with no return address. Inside was a single photograph. It was a picture of me, taken from a distance standing on the Azure Bluff the night I bought it. On the back, someone had written in elegant flowing script, "A thorn grows best in stolen soil. I know who you are, Elena." My breath hitched. I thought I had disappeared. I thought I was safe in the shadows of Silas's name. But someone was watching. And if they knew who I was, it was only a matter of time before my father found out. I looked at the photograph again, zooming in on the background. In the far corner of the frame, barely visible against the dark trees, was a figure holding a phone to their ear. I realized then that the information broker I had sold the data to might have sold my identity as part of a bigger deal. I wasn't just a buyer anymore. I was the prey. I picked up the phone to call Silas, but before I could dial, my office door swung open. It wasn't Silas. It was a woman I hadn't seen in years. The one woman who hated my mother more than I did. The woman standing in the doorway was Sarah Thorne, Silas's younger sister. I remembered her as a whirlwind of laughter and paint-stained aprons from my childhood. But the woman before me now was different. She was dressed in a sharp, ivory power suit, her eyes reflecting the cold steel of the city skyscrapers. She had been the one who taught me my first brushstroke, the one who told me that a canvas was the only place where a girl like me could truly be free. "You always did have a flair for the dramatic, Elena," Sarah said, closing the door softly behind her. She didn't move to hug me. She simply walked to the window, looking out at the construction cranes in the distance. Buying the bluff. It was a bold move. A bit loud for a ghost, don't you think? "How did you find me?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. I kept my hands flat on my desk, feeling the cool grain of the wood. "I'm the one you sold the data to," she said. turning around with a faint, knowing smile. Or rather, I own the firm that processed it. When I saw the sterling ledgers cross my desk, I knew there was only one person who could have found them. Julian is too stupid, and your father is too arrogant to think anyone would look. It had to be you. I felt a chill wash over me. The information broker wasn't a stranger. It was family. Of a sort. Don't worry, Sarah continued, sensing my unease. Your secret is safe with me, for now. But you aren't the only one playing this game. Your father is starting to realize that the anonymous buyer of the bluff isn't just a random investor. He's hired private investigators to track the shell company. You need to build your empire faster than he can tear it down. The next 2 years became a blur of concrete, glass, and silence. Under the name E.V. Thorne, I became a phantom in the architectural world. I didn't attend galas. I didn't do interviews. I let the work speak for itself. While my parents were busy fighting lawsuits and trying to maintain their crumbling social status, I was building the foundation of my revenge. Literally, I poured every cent I earned back into the Azure Bluff project. It wasn't just a house, it was a statement. The main villa was a fortress of privacy, but it was the guesthouse that held my focus. I spent nights obsessing over the details of that smaller structure. It was beautiful, yes, but it was designed with a specific psychological weight. The ceilings were slightly lower than the main house. The views, while stunning, were always framed by the shadow of the primary residence. It was a place designed to make whoever lived there feel secondary. During this time, I watched the Sterling family's slow descent from the heights of the city's social register. My father had been forced to sell his interest in the shipping empire he loved so much. My mother had stopped appearing in the society pages. They were still wealthy by normal standards, but in their world, they were becoming invisible. I received occasional updates from Silas. Julian lost another few million in a bad tech investment, he'd say over dinner. Or, your mother tried to charm her way into the autumn ball, but her name wasn't on the list. I listened to these reports with a calm, detached interest. It was like hearing about the weather in a country I no longer lived in. I wasn't happy about their failure, but I wasn't sad either. I was just waiting. By the time I turned 28, the glass cage on Azure Bluff was finished. It was a marvel of modern design, a jagged crown of glass, sitting atop the cliff. I moved in on a Tuesday, carrying nothing but a single suitcase and my old charcoal pencils. The first night in the house was silent. The only sound was the rhythmic thrum of the ocean against the rocks below. I sat in the darkened living room, the floor-to-ceiling windows making it feel as if I were floating over the abyss. I felt a sense of peace I hadn't known in years, but beneath it was a sharp, cold edge of anticipation. I had built my world. Now I just had to wait for theirs to finish collapsing. The turning point came 6 months later. I was in my studio, sketching the outlines of a new museum project, when my phone buzzed. It was an email from a prestigious law firm representing Arthur and Lydia Sterling. The tone of the email was a masterpiece of desperation masked as professional inquiry. They were looking for a long-term lease on a private property. They mentioned that they had heard the owner of the Azure Bluff estate was a discreet individual who appreciated the finer things. They were looking for a place to retire quietly while they reorganized their affairs. They didn't know the owner was the daughter they had thrown away. They only knew that the bluff was the last piece of their former glory, and they were willing to pay whatever was left of their dignity to be near it again. I sat there for a long time, the blue light of the screen reflecting in my eyes. I looked at the guest house through the window, the beautiful, elegant cage I had built for them. I called Sarah. They reached out, I said, my voice steady. And? Sarah asked. Are you going to let them in, or are you going to watch them drown from the shore? I'm going to let them in, I replied. But they have to sign my contract. Every single page of it. You realize that once they see you, the game changes, Sarah warned. They'll try to claim the house. They'll try to use your success to save themselves. Let them try, I said. They think they're coming home. They don't realize they're coming to a trial. I sent the reply through my lawyers. The terms were non-negotiable. They would live in the guest house. They would have no access to the main villa without an invitation. They would be responsible for their own upkeep, and most importantly, they had to sign a non-disclosure agreement that forbid them from ever mentioning their relation to the owner of the estate. The reply came back within an hour. They agreed to everything. They were so desperate to escape the shame of the city that they didn't even read the fine print. The day they were scheduled to arrive, the weather was uncharacteristically warm. The sun sparked off the water like 1,000 tiny diamonds. I stood on the balcony of the main house, hidden by the tint of the glass, and watched as a single aging town car wound its way up the driveway. My father got out first. He looked smaller than I remembered. His suit, once a symbol of his power, hung slightly loose on his frame. My mother followed, clutching her designer handbag like a life raft. They stood in the driveway, looking up at the main house in awe. "It's magnificent," I heard my mother whisper through the intercom system I had installed. Who could have built such a thing? I stepped out onto the balcony, the wind catching the hem of my white linen trousers. I didn't say a word. I just looked down at them. The moment they looked up and saw my face, the silence was more deafening than any scream. My mother dropped her bag. My father's face went a ghostly shade of gray, but as the shock began to settle into their eyes, I saw something else. I saw a flicker of the old Sterling greed. They didn't see a daughter they had wronged, they saw a golden ticket. My mother took a step forward, a fake trembling smile beginning to form on her lips. "Elena, oh my darling girl, we had no idea." I didn't smile back. I didn't move. I simply pressed a button on my remote, and the heavy iron gates of the guest house began to slide shut, separating their path from mine. "Welcome to the guest house," I said into the microphone. "Your keys are under the mat. Please be quiet. I have a very busy day ahead of me." But as I turned to walk back inside, I noticed a third person getting out of the car, someone I hadn't invited. The third person stepping out of the car was none other than Julian. He looked different. The golden boy polish had rubbed off, replaced by a frantic, nervous energy. His hair was slightly too long, and his movements were jerky as he adjusted his expensive yet wrinkled blazer. He looked up at my mansion with an expression that wasn't just awe, it was hunger. I watched from the balcony as my parents regained their composure. My mother, ever the actress, reached out to touch the cold iron of the gate I had just closed. "Elena," she called out, her voice fluttering like a wounded bird. "Sweetheart, we didn't know you were the one behind all this. If we had known, things would have been so different." I didn't reply. I simply turned and walked back into the cool, silent depths of my living room. I didn't need to hear their excuses. I had spent 3 years rehearsing this silence. Inside, the house was a sanctuary of my own making. Every piece of furniture was chosen for its texture and its history. I sat down at my desk and opened my bank statement. It was a habit now, not because I was greedy, but because every digit represented a brick I had laid myself. I was officially a millionaire several times over, but the money felt like a secondary prize. The real wealth was the control I felt as I watched the security cameras on my second monitor. The cameras showed my parents and Julian dragging their luggage toward the guest house. The guest house was beautiful. Anyone else would have considered it a dream home, but to the Sterlings, who were used to 60-room estates, it was a shack. I saw my mother run a hand over the stone exterior, her face twisting in a grimace when she realized the door wasn't made of the rare mahogany she preferred. I spent the rest of the day in a state of quiet observation. I didn't go down to meet them. I didn't send food. I wanted them to sit in the space I had provided and realize that their survival now depended entirely on my whim. As the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of bruised orange and deep violet, I prepared a small celebration for myself. I didn't call friends. I didn't host a party. I poured a single glass of vintage wine, a bottle I knew my father had been hunting for years, and sat by the fire. The crackle of the wood was the only sound in the room. I felt the warmth of the fire on my face and thought about the birthday dinner 3 years ago. Back then, I was a girl who felt like she was disappearing. Tonight, I felt solid. I felt permanent. I was interrupted by a chime from the gate intercom. I looked at the screen. It was Julian. He was standing there alone, looking over his shoulder toward the guest house where our parents were likely unpacking. "Elena, I know you're listening," he said, his voice crackling through the speaker. "Look, I get it. You're mad. You won, but let's be realistic. We're family. You have all this space and we're cramped in that little box down there. I've got a business proposal for you, something that could double your net worth in 6 months. Just let me up for 5 minutes." I leaned over and pressed the button. "Julian," I said, my voice low and calm. "You have exactly 30 seconds to leave the gate before I call the security team I pay 5 figures a month to protect this space." "Elena, don't be like that." 25 seconds, I countered. He muttered a curse under his breath and kicked the gravel, turning back toward the guest house. I watched him go, noting the way he looked at the perimeter fence, as if searching for a weak point. Julian was a predator who had run out of prey, and now he was looking at his own sister as a target. Later that night, I received a text from Sarah. The first night is always the hardest for them. They'll try to play on your guilt. "Don't forget why you built the cage, Elena." I didn't need the reminder. Every time I closed my eyes, I could still feel the cold rain on my birthday. I could still hear the sound of the silver spoon against the glass. I walked to the window and looked down at the guest house. A single light was on in the kitchen. I could see the silhouette of my mother sitting at the table, her head in her hands. For a fleeting second, a tiny spark of the old Elena, the girl who wanted to fix things, flickered in my chest. But then I looked at the cream-colored envelope sitting on my mantel, the one containing the bill they had given me for my life. The spark died. I went to bed and slept the deepest sleep I had had in years. I was safe. I was rich. I was in control. But the next morning, I woke up to something I hadn't expected. When I looked out the window, there was a large, brightly colored truck parked in front of the guest house. Men were unloading crates of expensive-looking furniture and art. I checked my legal documents. The lease stated they could bring personal belongings. But this was more than a few suitcases. This was an installation. I threw on a robe and walked down the path, the morning dew cold against my feet. As I approached the guest house, my mother stepped out, wearing a silk robe that looked suspiciously like the one I had burned 3 years ago. "Good morning, Elena," she said, her voice regaining its old haughty edge. "We decided that if we are to stay here, we must make it habitable. Your father contacted some old associates. It seems the Sterling name still has a little credit left in the world." She smiled, and for the first time it wasn't a plea. It was a challenge. "We're hosting a small tea this afternoon," she added, smoothing her hair. A few of the neighbors stopped by to introduce themselves. They were so surprised to find out we were the ones moving in. My heart hammered in my chest. I had spent years making sure no one knew I lived here. I had maintained my privacy like a religion. And in less than 24 hours, my mother was already turning my sanctuary into a stage for her social comeback. "Who did you invite, Mother?" I asked, my voice dangerously quiet. "Oh, just the owners of the vineyard next door and the couple from the hilltop," she said airily. "They're very excited to meet the mysterious owner of the estate. I told them you were my shy daughter who handles the administrative side of our affairs." She was rewriting the narrative. She was telling the world that this was still their empire and I was just the help. I looked past her into the guest house and saw Julian talking animatedly on his phone, gesturing toward my main villa. I realized then that letting them in wasn't the end of the game. It was just the beginning of a much more dangerous one. They weren't just staying in my guest house, they were planning to take back the main one. But they had forgotten one very important detail about the contract they had signed so blindly. I stood on the gravel path, the morning sun feeling uncomfortably warm on my neck. My mother's smile was a weapon I knew well. It was the same one she wore when she convinced the board of the botanical gardens to fire her rival. It was the smile of a woman who believed that reality was whatever she whispered into the right ears. "The administrative side?" I repeated, my voice coming out as a soft, rhythmic hum. I didn't let my anger sharpen the words. "Is that what you told the neighbors, Mother?" "Well, darling, you've always been so good with numbers and sketches," she said, reaching out to pat my cheek. I stepped back before her hand could touch me. Her eyes flickered with a brief flash of annoyance, but she kept the mask in place. "The world doesn't need to know the messy details of our family's transition. It's much better for everyone if they think we are here to oversee the expansion of the Sterling legacy." She turned to instruct one of the movers on where to place a heavy gilded mirror, a piece of the past that looked hideous against the clean, modern lines of my guest house. I didn't argue. I didn't tell her that the neighbors already knew me as E.V. Thorne, the architect who had changed the skyline of the city. I simply turned and walked back up the hill to my sanctuary. I had work to do, and as I walked, I recalled the exact wording of Clause 14 in the lease agreement they had signed. The tenant agrees that the guest house is a residence only. Any attempt to conduct business, host public gatherings, or misrepresent the ownership of the primary estate results in immediate termination of the lease without notice. I sat at my mahogany desk and pulled up the security feed. I watched as the neighbors' cars began to arrive at the lower gate. I saw the vineyard owners, a pleasant couple I had shared tea with many times, looking confused as my mother greeted them at the guest house door like a queen receiving her subjects. I didn't call the police. I didn't storm down there to humiliate her. Instead, I picked up my phone and called my property manager, Marcus. "Marcus," I said, leaning back in my chair and watching the screen. "The guests at the guest house are currently hosting an unauthorized event. Please activate the privacy protocol for the lower grounds." "Are you sure, Ms. Thorne?" Marcus asked, his voice hesitant. "It can be quite disruptive." "I'm very sure," I replied. A few minutes later, I saw the result. The guest house was equipped with a state-of-the-art smart system designed for extreme privacy. Suddenly, the high-intensity sprinklers, designed to keep the perimeter lush and the trespassers away, roared to life. But they weren't aimed at the grass. They were calibrated to create a water wall around the guesthouse patio. On the monitor, I watched the horror unfold in high definition. The vineyard owners jumped back as a literal wall of water soaked their expensive linen suits. My mother's tea table, laden with porcelain and delicate finger sandwiches, was obliterated in seconds. The gilded mirror the movers had just placed was drenched, but the most effective part of the protocol wasn't the water, it was the sound. A low-frequency hum, designed to discourage loitering, began to pulse from the outdoor speakers. It wasn't loud, but it made conversation impossible. It was the sound of a silent, "Get out." The neighbors didn't stay to investigate. They ran for their cars, shielding their heads with their hands. My mother stood in the middle of the deluge, her silk robe clinging to her, looking up at my villa with an expression of pure, unadulterated rage. I watched her through the glass. I took a slow sip of my tea, feeling the warmth of the porcelain against my palms. I was the architect of this fate. I had designed this house to be a haven for me and a lesson for them. An hour later, once the guests had fled and the water had been turned off, there was a frantic pounding at my front door. I checked the camera. It was my father. He looked disheveled, his breathing heavy. I opened the door just a crack. "Yes, father. What was that?" He hissed, his face red. "You humiliated your mother. Our guests think we're living in a malfunctioning car wash. You need to fix that system immediately." "The system isn't malfunctioning," I said, my voice as cool as the air-conditioned hall behind me. "It's working exactly as intended. The lease you signed strictly prohibits public gatherings or the hosting of events. You violated the terms within 24 hours. I could have you evicted right now." He slumped, the fight suddenly draining out of him. He looked past me into the house, his eyes wandering over the expensive art and the sprawling view. "Elena, we are your parents. We have nowhere else to go. The city house is gone. The firm is in receivership. We just wanted to feel like ourselves again for one afternoon." "You wanted to feel like the people who could throw a daughter away on her birthday," I corrected him. "But those people don't exist anymore. You are tenants in a guest house. If you want to stay, you will follow the rules. If you try to use my home to build a lie, you will find yourselves on the street with your wet furniture." I started to close the door, but he put a hand out to stop it. "Julian," he whispered. "He's been talking to some people. He thinks he's found a way to get the Sterling name back into the market. He just needs a little seed money. He was going to ask you tonight." "Julian has no more seed money coming from me," I said. "And if I were you, I would watch him closely. Men like Julian don't build, they only consume." I closed the door and locked it. The silence of the house rushed back in, but it felt different now. The war had moved inside the gates. That evening, I sat in my studio, but I couldn't focus on my sketches. I kept thinking about my father's face. For a second, I had seen a glimmer of the man who used to carry me on his shoulders when I was 5, but then I remembered the way he had slid that cream-colored envelope across the table without blinking. I pulled out a hidden drawer in my desk and looked at a small, old photograph. It was of me and Julian when we were children, playing in the garden of the old estate. We looked so happy. We didn't know about trusts or legacies or betrayals. I felt a tear prick my eye, the first one in years. I wiped it away quickly. Weakness was a luxury I couldn't afford. My phone buzzed. It was an alert from the security system. Someone was moving around the perimeter of the main villa. Someone who knew where the cameras were. I pulled up the feed, expecting to see Julian or a stray animal. Instead, I saw a dark figure crouched near the power box of the main house. They weren't trying to get in. They were holding something, a small electronic device that was blinking with a rhythmic red light. I realized with a jolt of ice-cold fear that this wasn't a family squabble anymore. My parents might be desperate, but they weren't tech-savvy. Someone else had followed them here. Someone who knew exactly how to dismantle the fortress I had built. I reached for the alarm, but as my finger touched the button, the entire house plunged into total suffocating darkness. The darkness was absolute. In a house made of glass, I was used to the moonlight being my guide, but tonight heavy clouds had swallowed the stars. I sat perfectly still in my chair, my heart a slow, heavy drum in the silence. I didn't panic. Panic is for people who have something to lose. I had already lost everything once. Now, I was just a woman defending a fortress. I reached into the top drawer of my desk and pulled out a small tactical flashlight. I didn't turn it on. Instead, I waited for my eyes to adjust. The silence was deep, but it wasn't empty. I could hear the faint metallic cooling of the house's ventilation system and the distant muffled roar of the ocean. Then, I heard it. A soft click-clack of boots against the marble terrace outside. I moved like a shadow, staying low and away from the windows. I made my way to the utility closet where the manual override for the security shutters was located. With a firm tug, I engaged the steel plates. One by one, The floor-to-ceiling windows were covered by reinforced metal. The sound was like a series of low thunderclaps, echoing through the empty halls. Once the house was sealed, I turned on my flashlight, the beam cutting a sharp path through the dust motes. I headed to the basement where the backup generator lived, but as I reached the heavy steel door, I saw that it was already ajar. A cold shiver ran down my spine. No one should have been able to get past the biometric locks. "You always were too smart for your own good, Elena," a voice whispered from the shadows. I swung the light toward the sound. It was Julian. He was sitting on a crate of spare parts, tossing a small electronic jammer, the device I had seen on the camera, up and down in his hand. He looked tired, but there was a manic gleam in his eyes that I didn't recognize. "Julian," I said, my voice as steady as a rock. "You're trespassing. I could have the police here in 10 minutes. "The police?" Julian laughed, a dry hacking sound. "With what phone? I've jammed the cellular signal for the whole bluff. And besides, I'm not trespassing. I'm just visiting my dear sister's basement. Family is allowed to visit, right? What do you want?" I asked, keeping the light fixed on his face. "I want what's ours," he said, standing up. The jammer clattered to the floor. "Do you have any idea what it's like out there? The Sterling name is a joke. People laugh when I walk into a club. Dad is a shell of a man, and Mom spends all day crying over jewelry she had to sell, and here you are living in a palace built on the secrets you stole from us." "I didn't steal them, Julian. I just kept the receipts," I replied. "Our father built his empire on lies. I built mine on talent. That's why mine is still standing and yours is at the bottom of the ocean." Julian took a step toward me, but I didn't flinch. "You think you're so untouchable, but you forgot one thing. I know who helped you. I know about Silas Thorne, and I know that the information you sold to buy this land wasn't just tax records. It was the blueprints for the city's private bank vaults, designs our father helped commission." My stomach turned. I knew the files were sensitive, but I hadn't looked at every single document. If Julian was telling the truth, I hadn't just used leverage. I had unknowingly traded in national security. "If I go down, Elena, you go down with me," Julian whispered, leaning into the light. "But I'm a nice guy. I'm willing to make a deal. Transfer $5 million to my account in the Caymans, and I'll disappear. I'll take Mom and Dad with me, and you can have your precious silence back." I looked at my brother, the boy I used to share my candy with, the man who was now trying to blackmail me in my own basement. I felt a profound sense of pity for him. He was a small man trying to play a big man's game, and he was failing. "I don't negotiate with ghosts, Julian," I said softly. I reached behind the doorframe and pressed a small red button. It wasn't an alarm. It was the release for the basement's fire suppression system. A thick, white fog of nitrogen and carbon dioxide began to hiss into the room. It wasn't lethal, but it made it impossible to see or breathe comfortably. Julian coughed, stumbling back. "What are you doing? You're crazy." "I'm the owner," I said, stepping back into the hallway and locking the steel door from the outside. I walked back upstairs, leaving him to wheeze in the dark. I knew he would be fine. The system would shut off automatically in 5 minutes, but he would be trapped until I decided to let him out. I went to the kitchen and poured myself a glass of water. My hands were perfectly still. I looked out through the narrow slit of the security shutters toward the guest house. The light was still on. I could see my father through the window. He wasn't crying. He was holding a phone to his ear, looking up at the main house. He wasn't talking to Julian. He was talking to someone else. The realization hit me like a physical blow. Julian was just the distraction. He was the loud, clumsy bait designed to get me into the basement while the real move was being made. I looked at the water in my glass. It was vibrating. Not from the ocean, but from the sound of a helicopter approaching from the north. I checked my tablet, which was connected to a hardwired internet line. A news alert popped up. Federal authorities raid office of renowned architect E.V. Thorne in connection with Sterling fraud case. My father hadn't come here to stay in my guest house. He had come here to serve me up as a scapegoat. He had tipped off the authorities, blaming me for the very crimes he had committed, using the files I had sold to Sarah as proof that I was the mastermind all along. The guest house wasn't their refuge. It was their front row seat to my destruction. I stood in the center of my dark, silent palace, listening to the thrum of the helicopter blades getting closer. I had built a fortress, but I had built it on land my enemy still knew how to navigate. I had one move left. It was a move that would destroy the Sterling name forever, but it would also mean I could never be Elena again. I sat down at my computer and began to type, but as the first helicopter searchlight swept across the glass of my living room, the guest house door opened. My mother stepped out, wearing a beautiful dry silk dress. She looked up at the light, a glass of champagne in her hand, and toasted the sky. She wasn't mourning her daughter. She was celebrating her return to the spotlight. The searchlight from the helicopter sliced through the gaps in my security shutters like a white-hot blade. I didn't move. I sat in the darkness of my office, the blue glow of my computer screen reflecting in my eyes. Outside, the world was loud, the roar of engines, the shouting of commands over a megaphone, the crashing of waves. But inside my mind it was perfectly still. I watched the monitor. My mother was still standing on the lawn of the guest house, her silhouette framed by the artificial light. She looked like she was posing for a portrait. She had waited 3 years for this moment, to see me brought low, to see the prodigal daughter escorted out in handcuffs so she could claim she was the victim of my deceptive brilliance. I turned back to the screen. My fingers danced across the keys with a rhythm that was almost musical. I wasn't deleting files, I was releasing them. Every architect has a black box, a place where they keep the drafts that were too dangerous to build. My black box contained the digital signatures of every contract my father had ever forced me to witness as a teenager. It contained the audio recordings I had captured on my phone during those long, silent dinners where he thought I wasn't listening. I had been a ghost for 3 years, but ghosts see everything. I hit the enter key. The data didn't go to the police. It didn't go to the news. It went to a very specific set of private investigators who worked for the families my father had swindled decades ago. If the government wanted a scapegoat, I would give them a feast instead. The front door of the villa groaned under the pressure of a battering ram. I stood up, smoothed the front of my black silk trousers, and walked toward the foyer. I didn't hide. I didn't run. I walked with the slow, deliberate grace of a woman who was exactly where she was supposed to be. The doors burst open. Agents in tactical gear flooded the hallway, their flashlights blinding. "Hands where we can see them," they barked. I raised my hands slowly. "The files you are looking for are in the open safe in the library," I said, my voice calm and clear. "You'll find that they don't belong to Evie Thorne. They belong to Arthur Sterling. I believe you'll find his thumbprint on the original physical deeds." I saw the confusion on their faces. They had been told I was a criminal hiding from the law. They found a woman who looked like she was welcoming guests to a gallery opening. As they led me out of the house, I saw my father standing near the guest house gate. He was trying to look somber, but he couldn't hide the twitch of a smile. He thought he had won. He thought that by throwing me to the wolves, the investigators would stop looking at him. But as I passed him, I stopped. The agents tried to pull me along, but I planted my feet. I looked at my father, really looked at him, for the last time. "You should have checked the guest house lease more carefully, father," I whispered. "What are you talking about?" he snapped, his voice trembling with a sudden sharp fear. "The guest house is built on a separate deed," I said, a small cold smile touching my lips. "And that deed is tied to a debt, your debt. By moving in, you legally acknowledged the transfer of all your remaining liabilities to this property. You didn't just find a home. You found your prison." The agents pulled me away then, but I heard the sound of a second set of sirens approaching from the driveway. These weren't federal agents coming for an architect. These were the city police, arriving with an arrest warrant for the hit-and-run Julian had committed, and the evidence that our father had helped him cover it up. I was placed in the back of a black SUV. I watched through the tinted glass as the police bypassed me and headed straight for the guest house. My mother's glass of champagne shattered on the gravel. My father tried to run toward the cliffside, but he was tackled before he could reach the edge. I was driven away in silence. I wasn't afraid of the police station. I knew my legal team was already there, and I knew the evidence I had just released would clear my name within hours. The federal raid was a storm that would blow over, leaving me standing and them in ruins. As the car wound down the coastal road, I looked back at the Azure Bluff. My house sat there, dark and silent, a crown of glass on a throne of stone. It looked lonely, but it also looked free. I spent the night in a quiet room at the precinct. They didn't put me in a cell. They put me in an interview room with a cup of lukewarm tea. I sat there and watched the clock. At 4 a.m., Silas Thorne walked in, followed by Sarah. Silas looked like he had aged 10 years in a single night, but his eyes were bright. "It's over, Elena," he said, sitting down across from me. "The data you released, it's a bloodbath. Your father is being charged with everything from money laundering to obstruction of justice. Julian is being booked for the hit and run. And your mother? What about my mother?" I asked. "She's being named as a co-conspirator," Sarah said, her voice softer than usual. "She signed the documents that authorized the hush money for Julian's accident." I took a sip of the tea. It was bitter, but I didn't mind. "And the house? The bluff? It's yours," Silas said. "Completely. But the press is going to be all over it. You can't go back there for a while. You need to disappear again. I don't want to disappear, I said. I've spent 3 years being a ghost. I want to be seen. I walked out of the police station at dawn. The sun was rising over the city, turning the gray concrete into gold. There were no cameras yet. The world didn't know the story had shifted. I went to a small hotel under a name that wasn't Sterling or Thorne. I slept for 12 hours. When I woke up, the news was full of my family's faces. They were being led away in orange jumpsuits, their glamorous lives stripped away in the harsh light of the morning. I felt a strange emptiness. For 3 years my life had been built around this moment. Now that it was here, I didn't feel the joy I thought I would. I just felt finished. I stayed in the hotel for a week, watching the fallout. The Sterling Empire was officially dead. The assets were being seized, the names were being erased, and the stories were being told by everyone except me. On the 8th day, I received a phone call from an unknown number. Elena. Her voice was thin, reedy, and stripped of all its arrogance. She sounded like an old woman. We're being held in the county facility, she whispered. The lawyers say we can get out on bail if we have collateral. They said the Guesthouse is still in our name. They said, we can sell it. I leaned back against the headboard of the bed, a cold, heavy feeling settling in my chest. The Guesthouse isn't in your name, Mother, I said. I told you to read the lease. But you said we could stay there, she wailed. You said it was ours. I said you were tenants, I replied, and you violated the lease. The property has already been reclaimed. In fact, I have a team there right now, clearing out your things. Where are we supposed to go? She sobbed. We have nothing left. Elena, please. I'm your mother. I looked at the birthday card I had kept in my wallet, the one she had sent me when I was 10, the only one that felt real. I pulled it out and looked at her handwriting. Do you remember my 25th birthday? I asked. There was a long silence on the other end of the line. I remember, she whispered. Then you have your answer, I said. I hung up the phone. I felt a weight lift off my shoulders. But as I looked at the TV, a new headline caught my eye. It wasn't about the Sterlings. It was about a mysterious buyer who had just purchased the land directly adjacent to the Azure Bluff. The buyer's name was redacted, but the logo on the filing was one I recognized. It was a single perfect circle, with a charcoal line through the center. My own mark. The one I had drawn on the back of the disownment papers. I hadn't bought that land. I realized then that someone else was playing a game I didn't know about. Someone was using my own symbols against me. The silence of my hotel suite was broken only by the hum of the air conditioner. I stared at the television screen, my eyes fixed on that logo, the circle with the charcoal line. It was a private mark, something I had scribbled in a moment of despair on a rainy park bench years ago. I had never shared it with Silas. I had never shared it with Sarah. To the rest of the world it was just a shape. To me it was a scar. The realization that someone else was using it felt like a cold hand tightening around my throat. I wasn't the only one who had been watching. I checked out of the hotel within the hour. I didn't go back to the city. I drove toward the coast, toward the Azure Bluff. I needed to be in my own space, surrounded by the walls I had designed, to think. The drive was long and winding, the gray asphalt hugging the cliffs as the ocean churned violently below. The weather was turning. A storm was brewing on the horizon, the sky a bruised purple that matched my mood. When I reached the gates of my estate, I stopped. The Guesthouse sign I had installed was crooked. The lawn, usually manicured to perfection, was littered with the remnants of my mother's ill-fated tea party, broken porcelain and sodden napkins. It looked like a graveyard of a life that never really belonged here. I bypassed the Guesthouse and drove up the steep incline to the main villa. I entered the house and felt the familiar clinical chill of the air. I didn't turn on the lights. I walked to the floor-to-ceiling windows and watched the storm move in. A flash of lightning illuminated the driveway. In that split second, I saw a car parked at the very edge of my property, near the newly purchased land. It was a simple, dark sedan, nothing like the luxury vehicles the Sterlings favored. I didn't wait for them to come to me. I grabbed a heavy coat and walked out into the wind. The air was thick with salt and the scent of rain. I walked down the path, my boots crunching on the gravel, until I reached the boundary line. A figure was standing there, looking out at the sea. They were wearing a long, dark coat, their back to me. The view is better from the balcony, I said, my voice projecting over the wind. But I suppose you already know that since you've been watching me from a distance. The figure turned slowly. It wasn't a federal agent. It wasn't Silas. It was a woman, perhaps in her late 50s, with silver-streaked hair and eyes that held a depth of sadness I recognized instantly. She looked familiar, but I couldn't place her. She didn't look like a Sterling, but she moved with a quiet authority that suggested she had once walked in similar circles. Elena, she said. Her voice was soft, but it carried perfectly. I wasn't sure you'd remember me. You were very young when the first betrayal happened. Who are you? I asked, taking a step closer. My name is Catherine, she said. I was your father's first partner. Not Silas. I was the one who helped him build the original foundation, the one he erased before you were even born. He didn't just disown you, Elena. He's been disowning people his entire life to keep the light on himself. I felt a jolt of recognition. Catherine. I had seen her name on the oldest documents in the encrypted files, the ones I hadn't looked at closely. She was the C. Miller who appeared on the original deeds. You bought the land next door, I stated. I did, she nodded. Not as a threat, but as a shield. I knew what your father was planning. I knew he was going to try to use you as a scapegoat. I've been working with Sarah Thorne for months to ensure that when the dust settled, you'd have more than just this house. You'd have an ally. Why help me? I asked, my eyes narrowing. You don't know me. I know the look of a girl who has been told she is nothing by the people who were supposed to give her everything, Catherine said. She reached into her pocket and pulled out a small weathered piece of paper. She handed it to me. It was a drawing, a simple charcoal circle with a line through it. You didn't invent that mark, Elena, she said gently. I did. I drew it on the back of my own exit papers 30 years ago. It's a symbol of the circle being broken. I saw you drawing it in the park that night. I was the one in the car with Silas. He didn't find you by accident. I told him where you'd be. The world felt like it was shifting under my feet. My entire independent rise, my sanctuary, my revenge. It hadn't been a solo journey. I had been guided. I felt a surge of anger, then a wave of profound relief. I wasn't alone. So, what happens now? I asked. The Sterlings are in jail. The house is mine. The revenge is complete. Is it? Catherine asked, looking up at the main villa. They're in jail, yes, but they still have the one thing you can't take away with a lawsuit. They have the narrative. They are playing the victims in every headline. If you want to truly win, you have to do more than take their money. You have to take their voice. Before I could respond, a loud metallic bang echoed from the bottom of the hill. We both turned. The gates of the guesthouse had been forced open. A taxi was idling at the entrance and someone was climbing out. It wasn't my parents. They were behind bars. It was Julian. He had been released on bail. And he wasn't alone. He was with a man in a dark suit, who looked like he belonged in a courtroom, not a coastal estate. Julian began walking up the driveway toward the main house, his face twisted in a look of desperate triumph. He was shouting something, but the wind swallowed the words. He shouldn't be here, I whispered, reaching for my phone to call security. Wait, Catherine said, putting a hand on my arm. Look at who is with him. I looked closer. The man with Julian wasn't a lawyer. I recognized him from the black box files I had released. He was the head of the construction firm my father had used to skip on safety regulations. The man whose testimony could either sink my father forever or pull me down with him. Julian wasn't here to beg. He was here to negotiate a new betrayal. He's going to offer you a choice, Elena, Catherine warned, and you need to decide right now how far you're willing to go to keep this house. The rain finally began to fall, cold and sharp. As Julian reached the boundary line, he stopped 10 feet away from us, breathing hard. Elena, he yelled, I have the one thing that can save Dad, and if you don't give me the keys to this house and the Thorne accounts, I'm going to tell the feds that you were the one who signed the construction waivers. I have the copies, Elena, the ones you thought you burned. I looked at Catherine, then back at my brother. My heart was calm. I felt the familiar weight of the silk scarf around my neck. Julian, I said, my voice cutting through the storm like a bell. You've always been a bad gambler. You're betting on a hand that doesn't exist. But as I spoke, Julian pulled a folder from his jacket. He held it up, the rain instantly soaking the pages. Do you want to see the signatures, Elena? He sneered. Or should I just call the prosecutor right now? The rain was no longer a drizzle. It was a deluge that turned the gravel path into a river of gray silt. Julian stood there, his wet hair plastered to his forehead, holding the folder like a shield. The man in the dark suit remained a few paces back, his face a mask of professional indifference. He was a shark waiting for the scent of blood. I didn't think you had it in you, Julian, I said, my voice barely raised. I didn't move toward him. I stood my ground next to Catherine, the wind whipping my coat around my legs, to forge my signature. That takes a level of effort you usually reserve for picking out which bottle of wine to steal from Dad's cellar. It's not a forgery, Elena, Julian screamed over a crack of thunder. You signed these when you were 18. Don't you remember? That summer at the lake house? Dad told you they were internship papers. You were so eager to please him, so desperate for a pat on the head, you didn't even read them. A cold knot tightened in my stomach. The lake house. I remembered the summer I turned 18. I had spent every day in the sun sketching the water, feeling like I was finally part of the family. My father had brought me a stack of papers one afternoon, telling me that if I wanted to be an architect, I needed to understand the administrative side of the business. I had signed dozens of pages, trusting the man who had tucked me into bed every night of my childhood. I looked at Catherine. Her eyes were steady, watching Julian with the detachment of a scientist observing a specimen. "He's telling the truth, isn't he?" I whispered to her. "The signature might be real," Catherine replied, her voice low and calm, "but the intent was fraud. A signature obtained through deception is a hollow victory, Elena. But in a court of law, hollow victories can still send you to prison." Julian saw the hesitation on my face and his grin widened. It was a jagged, ugly expression. "There it is. The perfect Elena is finally cracking. Here's the deal, sis. I don't want the house for myself. I want the deed transferred to a trust that Dad controls. We'll sell this place, pay off the fines, and we'll move back to the city. You can keep your little studio in the warehouse. We'll even give you a monthly allowance, like the old days." The arrogance of his offer was staggering. He was standing on my land in the middle of a storm, threatening to take away the life I had built with my own hands, and he had the nerve to offer me an allowance. "And if I refuse?" I asked. "Then the man behind me walks these papers into the district attorney's office tomorrow morning," Julian said, gesturing to the silent figure in the suit. "You'll be the face of the Sterling scandal. Not Dad. Not me. You, the rebellious daughter who used her family's connections to build a corrupt empire. Imagine the headlines, Elena. It'll destroy your career before the first brick of your next project is even laid." I took a slow, deep breath, letting the cold air fill my lungs. I looked past Julian, down toward the guest house. The lights were off now, the small building looking abandoned and small against the backdrop of the churning sea. I looked at the man in the suit. "And you? What is your price for silence?" The man stepped forward, his voice a dry rasp. "I represent interests that simply want the Sterling name to stop being a liability, Miss Thorne. If the family is restored to their previous standing, my clients are satisfied. If you become the sacrificial lamb, my clients are also satisfied. We are flexible." He was a mercenary. My father had hired him to ensure that the blame landed exactly where it was most convenient. "I need to see the documents," I said. Julian hesitated, then stepped forward, holding the folder out. I reached for it, but he pulled it back at the last second. "Oh no, we do this inside," Julian said, nodding toward the main villa. "I'm freezing, and I want to see what my future living room looks like." I looked at Catherine. She gave me a tiny, almost imperceptible nod. I stepped aside, gesturing toward the house. "Fine, let's go inside." We walked up the path in silence, the only sound the heavy thrum of the rain. Inside, the villa was warm and smelled of expensive cedar. I didn't turn on the overhead lights. I only activated the soft amber floor lamps that cast long shadows across the minimalist furniture. Julian walked into the center of the living room, dripping water onto the white marble floor. He looked around, his eyes wide with a mix of jealousy and greed. "You really did it, didn't you? You built the house Dad always wanted." "I built the house Dad could never understand," I corrected him. I sat down in one of the leather armchairs, my back straight. "Put the papers on the table, Julian." He tossed the folder onto the mahogany coffee table. I opened it slowly. There they were. My signatures dated 7 years ago. The ink was faded, but the handwriting was unmistakably mine. The loopy E and the sharp A I had practiced 1,000 times. They were waivers for structural inspections on 3 of the Sterling's biggest residential projects that were now known to be death traps of shoddy materials and bribed officials. If these went public, I wouldn't just lose my house. I would lose my license. I would lose my soul. "I'll give you 48 hours to sign the transfer papers," Julian said, leaning against the glass wall. "Don't bother calling Silas. He's already being investigated for his ties to the information you sold. You're on your own, Elena." I closed the folder. I didn't look at Julian. I looked at the dark reflection of myself in the glass. "You're right about one thing, Julian," I said, my voice barely a whisper. I was desperate for a pat on the head. I was a child who wanted her father to love her. But that girl is dead. You and Mom and Dad killed her 3 years ago on my birthday. I stood up and walked to the wall-mounted intercom. I pressed a button that wasn't for security. It was for the house's internal recording system, the one Catherine had helped me sync to a secure off-site server. "Did you get all of that, Sarah?" I asked the empty air. A voice crackled through the speakers. Sarah Thorne's voice, sharp and clear. "Every word, Elena. including the part where the gentleman in the suit admitted his clients would be satisfied if they framed you. Julian's face went pale. The man in the suit straightened his tie, his eyes darting toward the door. Blackmail is a very difficult crime to prove, Julian, I said, stepping toward him. But when you do it on a recorded line in front of a witness who happens to be a licensed private investigator, well, the odds aren't in your favor. You can't use that, Julian stammered. Those papers are still real. You'll still go to jail. Maybe, I said, my voice as calm as a frozen lake. But I'll be going to jail for a mistake I made as a child. You'll be going to jail for a crime you committed as a man. And Dad, he'll be going to jail for both. I picked up the folder and held it over the small, decorative fireplace in the corner of the room. I didn't light it. I just held it there. Now, I said, here is my counteroffer. You take your investor and you walk out of this house. You tell the district attorney the truth, that you and Dad coerced those signatures. If you do that, I might not release the recording of this conversation to the police tonight. You're bluffing, the man in the suit said, though his voice lacked conviction. Try me, I replied. As they backed toward the door, Julian looked at me with a hatred so pure it felt like a physical heat, but beneath the hate, I saw the truth. He was terrified. He was a little boy playing with matches, and he had finally burned his own house down. They left, disappearing into the rainy night. I stood in the center of my silent palace, the folder still in my hand. Catherine walked into the room from the hallway. She hadn't said a word during the confrontation. She looked at the papers, then at me. You handled that well, she said. But you know they won't stop. Julian is a cornered animal. I know, I said. I walked to the window and watched their car lights fade into the distance. But I have something they don't have. What's that? Catherine asked. The Guesthouse keys, I said, pulling a small silver ring from my pocket. And a plan for tomorrow morning that doesn't involve a courtroom. I looked at the folder. I knew the signatures were a threat, but I also knew something Julian didn't. I hadn't just signed those papers as an intern. I had hidden a small microscopic symbol inside the loop of my E, a symbol I used back then to mark my own work. A symbol that proved I wasn't just an intern. I was the one who had actually redesigned those buildings to be safe, only to have my father swap the blueprints after I signed the waivers. I wasn't the criminal. I was the whistleblower who didn't know she was one. The storm had passed by dawn, leaving the Azure Bluff draped in a thick silver fog. The world felt muffled, as if the coast itself were holding its breath. I stood on my balcony, watching the mist swirl around the guest house below. It was time for the final phase of their education. I had spent the night with Sarah and Catherine, poring over the black box files. We found it, the microscopic E, with the hidden dot I used to mark my original designs. It was the proof that the buildings I had signed for were not the ones that were eventually built. My father had swapped my safe, reinforced blueprints for cheaper, dangerous ones, after the waivers were signed. I wasn't his accomplice. I was his ultimate fallback plan. But I wasn't going to use this in a courtroom yet. I wanted them to feel the weight of their choices in the very place they had tried to steal. At 8 a.m., I walked down the path. I didn't take security. I didn't take Silas. I went alone, carrying a simple thermos of tea and a small leather-bound notebook. I used my master key to enter the guest house. The interior was a mess. The water from the privacy protocol had left damp streaks on the walls, and the expensive furniture my mother had brought in looked garish and out of place in the small rooms. My parents were there, having been released on an emergency bail bond, likely funded by whatever secret account Julian still held. My mother was sitting on a damp velvet sofa, her face pale and sunken. My father was at the small kitchen table, staring at a cold cup of coffee. They looked up as I entered. There was no anger left in their eyes, only a hollow, echoing fear. "Elena," my father whispered. His voice was cracked. "Julian told us about the recording. He said, 'You're going to destroy us.'" "You destroyed yourselves, Father," I said, sitting opposite him. I poured a cup of tea from my thermos and pushed it toward him. He didn't touch it. I'm just the one who turned on the lights so everyone could see the ruins. "We have nowhere else to go," my mother sobbed from the sofa. "The city house is being seized by the banks. The jewelry, they took it all for the bond. We are living in a 30-foot box, Elena. Is this your revenge? To watch us rot in a beautiful cage?" "No," I said calmly. "This isn't my revenge. This is your reality. You spent your lives building a world of glass and air, thinking you could never fall. I built this guest house to be solid. It's small, it's humble, and it's the only thing standing between you and the street." I opened my notebook. Under the new terms of your stay, since the previous lease was violated, you will have no staff. You will clean your own rooms. You will cook your own meals. And every Friday you will meet with me here. We will go through the family ledgers, and you will help me identify every person you swindled, every contractor you cheated, and every family you ruined. My father recoiled as if I had struck him. You want us to be informants against our own legacy? I want you to be honest, I said, for the first time in your lives. If you do this, I will allow you to stay here until the trials are over. I will pay for your legal defense. The real defense, not the mercenaries Julian hires. I will ensure you don't spend your final years in a state penitentiary. But in exchange, the Sterling name dies. You will sign over every remaining trademark and right to me. I will dissolve the company and use the assets to compensate the victims of those faulty buildings. The room went silent. The only sound was the distant cry of a seagull. My mother looked at the gilded mirror on the wall, the one that was now spotted with water damage. She seemed to realize for the first time that the reflection was no longer a queen. And Julian? She asked. Julian has made his choice, I said. He tried to blackmail me with forged intent. He is currently being questioned by the authorities regarding the hit and run and the intimidation of a witness. I cannot help him. He chose to be his father's son until the very end. My father looked at the tea I had poured. He finally picked it up, his hands shaking. He took a sip and closed his eyes. It's bitter, he remarked. It's the truth, father, I replied. It takes a while to get used to the taste. For the next few weeks, the guest house became a sight of quiet, grueling labor. I watched from my villa as my mother, the woman who had never boiled an egg in her life, learned to hang laundry on a line. I watched my father sit for hours over old paperwork, his brow furrowed as he admitted to crimes he had buried decades ago. It was a slow burn penance. They were living in a beautiful place, surrounded by the ocean they loved, but they were forced to look at the wreckage of their souls every single day. They were guests in a life they once owned, and the power dynamic was a constant, silent pressure. I didn't feel joy watching them struggle. I felt a strange, clinical sense of justice. It was like restoring an old building. You have to strip away the rot before you can see if the structure is worth saving. However, the peace was fragile. One evening, while I was reviewing a confession my father had written, I noticed a detail he had omitted, a name I hadn't seen before: Lucas Vane. I walked down to the guest house, the moon casting long, distorted shadows on the path. I found my father in the small library. Who is Lucas Vane? I asked, dropping the paper on the desk. My father's face went completely white, whiter than the night he had disowned me. He gripped the edge of the table so hard his knuckles turned blue. He's no one, he stammered. A ghost. A mistake from the early days. You're lying, I said, leaning in. Every time you've mentioned a mistake in these papers, it has led to a bank account or a victim. Lucas Vane has no records, no address, but his name is next to the largest offshore transfer in the Sterling history. Elena, leave it alone, my father pleaded. The feds don't know about him. No one knows about him. If you pull that thread, the whole world won't just fall on us. It will fall on you, too. I looked into my father's eyes and saw a terror I hadn't seen before. This wasn't the fear of prison. This was the fear of a man who had made a deal with the devil and knew the collection date was coming. I walked out of the guest house and back up to my villa. I called Silas. Silas, I said, find everything you can on a man named Lucas Vane, and tell the security team to double the perimeter watch. My father just told me we're not the only ones who own the Sterling secrets. But as I reached my front door, I realized the security system was already showing an alert. Not from the gate, from the guest house. The door was wide open, and the lights were flickering. The fog felt like a cold, wet hand against my skin as I ran back down the path toward the guest house. The flickering lights from the windows cast long, stuttering shadows across the lawn. When I reached the threshold, I stopped. The silence inside was heavy, broken only by the rhythmic click-hiss of a malfunctioning lamp. Father? Mother? I called out, my voice tight. I stepped into the living room. My mother was huddled in the corner of the velvet sofa, her eyes wide and glassy. She wasn't injured, but she looked as though she had seen a phantom. My father was sitting at the table, his head bowed, his hands shaking so violently he had to tuck them under his arms, and in the center of the room stood Julian. He looked terrible. His expensive jacket was torn, his shoes were caked in mud, and there was a desperate, wild energy radiating from him. But he wasn't alone. Standing behind him was a man I didn't recognize, a man with close cropped hair and a face that looked like it was carved from gray stone. He held himself with the terrifying stillness of a professional. Julian, I said, my voice dropping into that low, calm register that always infuriated him. "You're violating a dozen court orders just by being on this coast. Who is your friend?" "This is Lucas," Julian said, his voice cracking. He tried to sound brave, but he was trembling. Or at least, one of Lucas Vane's associates. "It turns out, Elena, that Dad didn't just forget to tell you about Lucas. He owed him a lot." The man in the shadows didn't move. He didn't blink. He just watched me with eyes that felt like they were calculating the cost of my life. "I told you to leave it alone, Elena," my father whispered, not looking up. "The money Dad used to start the second shipping line, it didn't come from a bank. It came from Vane. And Vane doesn't care about family dramas or revenge. He wants his interest." Julian stepped toward me, his face twisting into a manic grin. "He saw the news, Elena. He saw that the great E.V. Thorne has millions in offshore accounts and a palace on a cliff. He thinks it's time for the Sterlings to pay their debts. And since Dad and I are, shall we say, financially embarrassed, he's looking at you." "I am not responsible for our father's shadow debts, Julian," I said, though I could feel the cold weight of the situation settling in my chest. "In Vane's world, the blood pays for the blood." The silent man spoke for the first time. His voice was a thin, dry whisper that made the hair on my neck stand up. "Your father promised the Azure Bluff as collateral 30 years ago. He had no right to sell it to a shell company. He had no right to give it to you." I looked at my father. He wouldn't meet my eyes. He had known this all along. He hadn't just given me a bill for my life on my birthday. He had handed me a target. He had let me build this sanctuary knowing that, eventually, the monsters from his past would come to claim the bricks. "I see," I said, my mind racing. I reached into my pocket and slowly pulled out my phone. "Don't," the man warned, his hand moving slightly inside his coat. "I'm not calling the police," I said, keeping my movements slow and deliberate. "I'm calling my bank. If you want the interest, you want the liquid assets, not a pile of glass on a cliff that will take years to sell and attract the feds. I can transfer the first installment tonight. But Julian leaves, and my parents stay here, untouched." Julian laughed, a harsh, jagged sound. "You think you can just buy them off? Elena, they want the whole thing. They want the Thorne accounts. They want the Sterling trademarks. They want everything you built while we were rotting in your guest house." "Julian, be quiet," I snapped. I turned back to the man. "The house is a landmark. If I disappear or if the deed changes hands under duress, the alerts Sarah Thorne has set up will trigger a global freeze on every account I own. You'll have a house you can't live in and $0. Or you take a settlement, and I walk away from the Sterling name forever, leaving you to deal with the remains of their estate." The man seemed to consider this. The silence in the guest house was suffocating. My mother let out a small, whimpering sob. 10 million, the man said. "By midnight. 5 tonight," I countered. "The rest when I have proof that the debt is settled and the collateral on this land is legally dissolved." "Elena, no," my father cried out. "You don't understand who these people are." "I understand perfectly," I said, looking at my father with a cold, piercing clarity. "I'm buying the one thing you never could, a clean slate." The man nodded once. "Midnight. I will be waiting at the gate." He turned and walked out into the fog, moving as silently as a ghost. Julian stayed behind for a moment, looking at me with a mix of shock and pure, unadulterated envy. "You're actually going to do it," Julian whispered. "You're going to pay for him. After everything he did to you." "I'm not paying for him, Julian," I said, stepping closer to my brother until we were inches apart. "I'm paying for me. I'm paying to never have to hear the name Sterling again. I'm paying so that when I look in the mirror, I don't see a daughter or a sister. I see a woman who is finally, truly, alone." I pointed to the door. "Now get out. If I see you on this property again, I won't call the police. I'll call Vane." I imagine he'd like to have a long conversation with the golden boy about where the rest of the money went. Julian scrambled out the door, his bravado vanishing the moment he hit the dark. I turned to my parents. My mother had stopped crying and was just staring at me. My father looked broken, a small man in a small room. "You have until tomorrow morning to pack your things," I said, my voice flat. "The guest house is being sold to Catherine Miller. She will decide if she wants to keep you as tenants. I am leaving tonight." "Elena, please," my father began. "Don't." I cut him off. "I gave you a chance to be honest in the guest house. You chose to hide a monster that could have killed us all. You didn't just fail as a father, you failed as a human being." I walked out of the guest house and didn't look back. I went up to the villa, packed a single bag, and sat at my desk. I made the transfer. The numbers on the screen dwindled. the gold I had spent years gathering vanishing into the void. But as the transfer complete message flashed, I felt a weight lift off my chest that I hadn't even known was there. The house, the money, the revenge. It was all just another cage. I walked to the balcony and looked out at the ocean. The fog was finally lifting, revealing a sliver of the moon. I took the silver ring with the guesthouse keys and threw it over the railing. I didn't listen for the splash. I walked to my car, but as I opened the door, a light flickered in the woods at the edge of the property. Not a searchlight. A small, steady, green light. I realized then that Silas and Sarah hadn't been idle while I was negotiating. They had been watching the whole time. The small, steady green light in the woods didn't move. It wasn't a signal from an enemy. It was the all clear from Silas's private security team. I stood by my car, the engine ticking as it cooled, and watched as Silas and Sarah emerged from the shadows of the cypress trees. They weren't wearing tactical gear or carrying weapons. They were carrying tablets and folders, the tools of the only war that truly mattered in our world. "You transferred the money," Silas said. It wasn't a question. He looked at me with a mixture of pride and something that looked like mourning. "You bought your way out of a debt that wasn't yours." "It was the only way to kill the ghost, Silas," I replied, my voice catching in the salt-heavy air. "Vane would have hunted me forever. Now I'm just a bad investment he's moved on from." "He didn't move on," Sarah said, stepping forward. She turned her tablet toward me. "While you were talking to that man in the guest house, we were tracing the accounts. Lucas Vane isn't a person, Elena. It's a shell corporation. And do you know who owns the controlling interest in the subsidiary that holds your father's debt?" I looked at the screen. The names were a labyrinth of offshore holdings and blind trusts, but at the very center the ultimate beneficiary was listed. My heart stopped for a beat. "Julian," I whispered. "Not just Julian," Silas added. "Julian and your mother. They've been playing both sides from the start. They knew about the debt because they helped manage it years ago. They brought that man, the one from the construction firm, to scare you into paying a debt that they would eventually collect themselves. The betrayal was so deep it felt like a physical weight in my lungs. My mother, the woman who had cried on the damp sofa, and Julian, the brother who had looked so terrified. They were the ones holding the knife. They hadn't just come to the guest house for shelter. They had come to harvest me. "Where are they?" I asked. My voice was no longer just calm. It was cold. It was the sound of a winter that would never end. "They're still in the guest house," Sarah said. "They think you're leaving. They think they've won $10 million and the path to a new life. Let's go," I said. I didn't drive. I walked back down that gravel path for what I knew would be the last time. I didn't feel anger. Anger is a fire that consumes the person holding it. I felt like a surgeon about to remove a tumor. I entered the guest house without knocking. The scene was different now. My mother was standing by the kitchen counter pouring 2 glasses of expensive wine, not the tea I had left. Julian was leaning against the table, a smug, satisfied look on his face. My father was gone, likely asleep in the other room, still oblivious to the fact that his own wife and son were his true executioners. They both froze when they saw me. My mother's glass paused halfway to her lips. "Elena," she said, her voice regaining its polished porcelain edge. "I thought you had already left. We were just trying to find a bit of comfort after such a terrifying night." "The wine is a nice touch," I said, walking to the table. I picked up the bottle. "A bit expensive for destitute tenants, don't you think?" "Julian found it in the cellar." She lied, her eyes darting to her son. "I know about the debt," I said. I set the bottle down with a soft thud that seemed to echo in the small room. "I know about Vane. I know that the interest I paid tonight is currently sitting in a holding account that you two control." The silence that followed was absolute. Julian's smugness vanished, replaced by a sharp, cornered rat look. My mother didn't cry this time. She set her glass down and straightened her back, the mask finally falling away to reveal the cold, calculating woman beneath. "And what if we do?" she asked. "You gave it away freely, Elena. You wanted your freedom. Well, freedom has a price. We gave you a life of luxury for 25 years. We consider 10 million a fair settlement for the artistic daughter we had to tolerate. You didn't give me a life," I said. "You gave me a role in a play I didn't want to act in. And tonight the play is over." I pulled a small device from my pocket, the one Sarah had given me. The transfer I made wasn't to a bank. It was to a government escrow account. Since I reported the debt as an act of extortion and provided the evidence of Julian's involvement with the construction fraud, the money is currently flagged. It's not yours. It's evidence. Julian lunged toward me, but Silas and his security team were already in the doorway. Julian stopped, his face turning a dark, ugly shade of purple. "You bitch," he spat. You'd rather see us in prison than see us happy? I'd rather see you honest, I said. But since that's impossible, I'll settle for seeing you gone. I've spent my life wondering why you hated me so much. I thought it was because I wasn't like you, but I realize now it's because I am like you. I have your vision, your drive, and your strength. But I have one thing you'll never have. And what is that? She sneered. A conscience, I said. I signaled to Silas. The police are at the gate. They have the warrants for the extortion and the secondary fraud charges. Mother, Julian, I suggest you finish your wine. It's the last thing you'll taste that wasn't paid for by a state budget. I walked out of the guest house. I heard my mother's first real scream of rage, not sorrow, but the scream of a woman who had lost her last gamble. I heard Julian struggling as the zip ties were clicked into place. I walked up to the main villa and found my father standing on the terrace. He had heard everything. He looked at me, and for the first time, he didn't look like a titan or a villain. He looked like an old man who had realized he had spent his life building a house on sand. What will you do with the house, Elena? He asked. I'm selling it, I said, to a foundation for young artists, people who need a place to create without being told their work has to be a legacy. I'm keeping the warehouse studio in the city. It's the only place I ever felt like myself. And us? You'll go to the facility, I said. I've arranged for the best care possible, but it won't be luxury. It will be enough. I'll visit you once a month. We'll talk about the weather. We'll talk about nothing. But we will never talk about the Sterlings again. I walked to my car and started the engine. As I drove down the driveway, I saw the blue and red lights of the police cars winding their way up the hill. I didn't stop. I didn't look in the rearview mirror. The sunrise was beginning to break over the horizon, a pale, hopeful pink that touched the tops of the waves. I felt a strange sensation in my chest, a lightness that was almost frightening. I had no house. I had no family. I had significantly less money than I did 24 hours ago. But as I reached the main road and turned toward the city, I realized I had the one thing I had been sketching since I was a little girl in an attic. I had a blank canvas, but as I reached the city limits, my phone buzzed with a message from an unknown contact. It was a single image. It was a photo of the E with the hidden dot, but beneath it someone had added a second mark. A small, perfect heart. The city skyline at dawn was a jagged silhouette of promise. I drove through the empty streets, the cool air from the open window ruffling my hair. For the first time in my life, I wasn't heading toward a meeting, a construction site, or a confrontation. I was simply heading home, to the dusty, light-filled warehouse loft where Silas had first taken me in. I pulled up to the weathered brick building and sat in the car for a moment. I took a deep breath, the scent of rain-washed pavement and distant bakeries filling my lungs. I reached for my phone and looked at the message again. The E with the hidden dot and the small, perfect heart. I knew that handwriting. It wasn't Silas, and it wasn't Catherine. It was Sarah. I climbed the stairs to the loft, the wood creaking under my feet like an old friend. When I pushed open the heavy steel door, the space was exactly as I had left it. The large windows let in the soft, gray morning light, illuminating the stacks of canvases and the drafting table covered in charcoal dust. Sarah was there, sitting on a stool by the window, a cup of steaming coffee in her hands. She didn't turn around when I entered. "You're late," she said, her voice warm and steady. "I had to say goodbye to a few things," I replied, walking over to stand beside her. "The foundation papers for the Azure Bluff were filed an hour ago," Sarah said, finally looking at me. "The glass cage is officially a retreat for young artists now. The first group arrives next month. Most of them are kids who were told their dreams were a waste of time." "Good," I said, feeling a genuine smile spread across my face. "They'll need the fresh air." We sat in silence for a long time, watching the city wake up. I thought about the journey from that moonlit birthday dinner to this quiet loft. I had spent so much energy trying to prove I was more than a Sterling, trying to build a fortress that no one could breach. I realize now that the strongest walls weren't made of glass or steel. They were made of the truth. "The heart," I said, gesturing to my phone. "Why now?" Sarah smiled, a rare, soft expression that reached her eyes. "Because you finally stopped building, Elena. You spent years being an architect of revenge. I wanted to see if you could still be an architect of the heart. Giving up that money to stop Vane, that wasn't a business move. That was an act of love for yourself." She was right. I had spent my wealth to buy my own silence, and it was the best investment I had ever made. My father was now in a secure care facility, far from the cameras and the legal battles. My mother and Julian were facing years of litigation, their names forever linked to the greed that destroyed them. The Sterling Empire was a ghost story people would tell at dinner parties, A cautionary tale about what happens when you value the name more than the person. I walked over to a blank canvas, leaning against the wall. It was large, white, and intimidating. I picked up a charcoal pencil, the same one I had used to draw the circle years ago. "What are you going to paint?" Sarah asked. "I'm not going to paint," I said. "I'm going to design." I began to draw. Not a house, not a fortress, I drew a park. A place with open paths, low walls, and plenty of room for people to walk together. I drew a space where the light wasn't blocked by shadows, where the wind could blow through without being trapped by glass. I was no longer Evie Thorne, the phantom architect. I was Elena, just Elena. As the sun fully rose, casting long golden fingers of light across the floor, I felt a profound sense of peace. The calm drama of my life had reached its final act. The revenge was over, not because I had crushed my enemies, but because I had outgrown the need to see them fall. I had found my own ground, and it was solid. I put down the pencil and looked at the sketch. It wasn't perfect, but it was a start. "Silas is coming over later," Sarah said, standing up. "He wants to talk to you about a new project, a public library in the old district. He says they need someone who knows how to make a place feel like a home." "Tell him I'm interested," I said. "But tell him I have one condition." "What's that?" "My name goes on the front door," I said. "The whole name, Elena Sterling." I wanted the world to see the name one last time. Not as a symbol of greed, but as a signature of someone who had survived the storm and decided to build something beautiful in its wake. I walked to the balcony of the loft and looked out at the city. The noise was starting now, the honking of horns, the shouting of vendors, the hum of millions of lives intertwining. It was messy, it was loud, and it was perfect. I leaned against the railing, the sun warming my face. I was 28 years old, and my life was finally beginning.